So welcome to church. If you're new with us or if you're joining us for the umpteenth time, it's good to have you back. My name's Alan, and I serve as the pastor here at Vivid. And it's just, it's an amazing thing. I love what God's doing in our church. I hope you are blessed because you have attended today. And we've been working through the book of James. That's a book in the New Testament. And we've been going chapter by chapter, week over week. And today we conclude chapter 4 and go into chapter 5. My middle daughter, I heard her say to her older sister real emphatically, she said, "That's mine." And maybe you've heard one of your children utter that same phrase a time or two. And I run up the stairs and she had snatched that little blue Elsa doll away from her older sister. And now, for all intents and purposes, she was right when she said, "That's mine." It was hers. Her mom and I had bought it for her. We gave it to her as a gift. And so, in every respect, it was hers. But as I heard her say that, I got to thinking, now hang on a minute. You don't have a job. You didn't go and get a job and receive a paycheck for services rendered and take said money to go and purchase that thing. Brother Allen did. So I think I got a right to say, "Hey, that's mine," if it's anybody's. I got to thinking about that, and I said, well, hang on a minute. I didn't work at the factory where they heated up the plastic and, then sewed on this little blue dress and made this, multi-million-dollar iconic figure available to everybody. So if anybody was going to say, "That's mine," maybe it's the factory worker who got through their hands blisters over working through this thing. That's why I got to think about it. So, well, they weren't in the room when all those, overpaid Disney employees created this thing. And so if we were talking from that person's perspective, they'd look back at all of us and be like, "Well, I created Elsa Jack," which really is just Cinderella remade over, I just need to let you know it's not as cool as you think it is. And so if anybody had the right to say, "That's mine," it'd be this Disney employee. Well, I thought it was, interesting. A few weeks later, I was rummaging through one of the buckets of toys in Maisie's room. And once you know it, buried in the bottom of that little bucket was that Elsa doll. And I said, "Hey, Maisie, I thought you said that's mine, Don't you want it?" And she said, No, I don't really want it anymore." She looked at Emma and she said, "It's hers." And I was like, what? After all that commotion? After all that time? What do you mean it's yours? What was that all about? And then I got to thinking about the way that we usually treat things and how we have a tendency to say, "That's mine." And everything that you currently have in life, at some point when you exit this world, it would no longer be yours. And so if you pass that down to your grandson and it becomes theirs and they're the ones who can say, "That's mine," and then one day they pass it down to your great-grandson and it's no longer theirs, but now the great-grandson could say, "Well, actually, that's mine," and then one day they pass it down to your great-great-grandson and it's no longer yours, your grandson's your great-great-grandson, and now they're the ones who can say, "That's mine," then it's actually like we're playing a really long game of hot potato to see who can hang on to the objects the longest before losing it. So whose is it? Are we really owners, or are we something else? This is what James is coming after in James chapter 4 when he talks about our lives. James 4, verses 13 through 17 says this. If you got it, say, "I got it." If you need more time, say, "Hold up." Oh, you all on the same page, or you're just not brave enough to say it. James says, now listen, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. Why, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are but a mist, a vapor, a handbreadth that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it's the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes, and all such boasting is evil. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it's sin for them. And so what James is wanting to get out is that this place has been here a long time, and we're here but just for a moment. This thing called earth been around a lot longer than you and me. And since that's true, when we show up just for a moment, he starts teasing up this idea of how we invest our lives. And what he's saying is, since you're only here for a little while, you ought to do on earth the Lord's will. Because once you became a Jesus follower, your life is now not your own. And what was happening is they were still running their own will for their life. And then they were boasting about that what they were going to do. And what he's saying is, have you forgotten that your very life that Jesus requests when you say yes to him, that's not even your own anymore. What you ought to do, since you only have a short window here on earth, is say, if it's the Lord's will for my life, then I'll go and do this. What James is saying that we have to get in our heads is this. Our life, it's in my possession, but it isn't my possession. You got to get that right. That's the top of the funnel, because if you start thinking that you're CEO of You Incorporated, you're going to wind up in a ditch somewhere. Hey, that it's in my possession. All of you possess free will. Every one of us, we have the ability to determine if we go left or right. And that's what James is saying. He says, your life, it's in your possession, but you're not owners of it. No. You gave over the right to free will, if you're a Jesus follower, to somebody else. You want to know why this is so critical? Because we treat things differently that belong to someone else. If I let you borrow my daughter and you want to take her to Disney World, you better treat that possession with extra care, because it don't belong to you. When we borrow items from people, we take ownership over the responsibility of the time that we're borrowing it. We're like, this doesn't belong to me, and I really don't want to mess this up. This is their boat. I don't want to wreck their boat. Now, if it's my boat, I burn the engine out, baby, just trying to get it at top speed. It's mine. If I break it, I'll fix it, whatever. But if it's theirs, I really don't want to have that conversation, because we treat things differently that don't belong to us. And last I checked, Jesus said in John 15:19, you got to get this in your soul. He said, if you belonged to the world, it would love you as its own. That at one point in time, if you're a Jesus follower, you belong to the world. It owned you. He just dealt with sin in the last chapter. And he said we were entangled in that mess. We were entrenched in that mess. Anybody who has been forgiven by Jesus and now you follow him and you remember what it was like to feel owned by the world, just talk to me, raise your hand. You remember what owned? That's what he said. He said, Jesus, his very mouth is the one saying this, and said, if you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. And what you thought was love wasn't really love. It was a prison of sin and guilt and shame and defeat because it owned us. But there's good news in the house today because Jesus said, as it is, you do not belong to the world because I have chosen you out of the world. Which means that you belong to Jesus now. That your very life isn't your own. That you now take your cues from God, your plans to God. That you don't belong to you, you belong to Him. And the good news of the gospel is that He'll take anybody just the way they are. And when He takes you as the way you are, sometimes the enemy likes to creep in and try to remind you of who you used to be. And when he starts trying to creep in and remind you of who you used to be, in Philippians, it says that Jesus, when you call on Him and you pray, that He stands as a military officer called a guard between your heart and your mind in Christ Jesus, between you and the enemy, which means that He looks at the enemy and He says, you have no right to this believer. You know why? Because that's mine. That's mine. You are not your own, but you are His special possession. So says Peter, chapter 1, verse 9. You are God's royal priesthood, holy nation, that you are His special possession, that He called you out of darkness into His wonderful life. He says, you belong to me now. Now, this is huge because at the point that we die, doesn't it matter at that point who you belong to? Because you won't stay here either, and your life, the essence of it, your soul, your spirit belongs to somebody. I was talking to my father-in-law just last night, and I said, I got to add that to the message. And so I'm doing that right now. They were in a Bible study years ago on this text, James chapter 4. And it was a Sunday morning that they were reading through this passage. And this one gentleman said, I want to read that verse again. He lifted up his hand. His name was Rob Davis. He lifted up his hand and he said, why you don't even know what will happen tomorrow, what is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. And he said, right then he went and fell over dead on Sunday morning in church. I know it's a very strange concept, but that happened. Those were the last words out of his mouth, and the service stopped. They did CPR. They tried to all this. Hey, don't you know at that moment right there, those words become very, very real. Even further, doesn't it matter at that point who you belong to? That at that point, you belong either to the God of the universe or you don't. And luckily He did. And so we take great faith in knowing where He is, but I'm trying to explain to you how important that is, that He say, we don't know what tomorrow holds. And if we are God's special possession, now we want to adopt God's will for our life. This is why Jesus prayed, not my will be done, but yours. This is what I want you to understand. This must mean if we don't own our very own lives, but we belong to Jesus, that would make us something else. What are we here on earth? Here it is. We are stewards, not owners. We are stewards of these days, not owners of these days. We are stewards of every opportunity that we're given, which would mean if we are stewards, you gotta get this in your soul. Say, it's not mine, but it is my responsibility. Good God in heaven. If you don't leave with anything else but that today, you will have left with enough. It's not mine. This life is not mine. But it is my responsibility to what? To steward, however God tells me in this book, to steward my days. It's God's marriage between me and my wife. What is it? It is my responsibility to steward that marriage, to show the world what a covenant relationship looks like. Now, before I knew Jesus, that wasn't the purpose of marriage. It may have been an institutional contract. That's not it. It's an indispensable covenant now. Now, that's my responsibility to show you that and teach you that, because I don't own my marriage. It's God's marriage. Am I making sense? Those are not your kids. Those are God's kids. The greatest gift that he can bless you with, they will outlive you and mine will outlive me. And so I think to myself, God, how do I steward these kids? Well, your word says train up a child in the way that it should go. If I'm not even my own possession, then we have to ask ourselves, is anything in my possession mine? I need to say that again because you missed it. Okay. If I'm not my possession, is anything in my possession mine? It's not mine. It's my what? We're going to school. Come on. It's not mine. It's my. It's your responsibility. It's your responsibility. You got to get this right, or else you'll sound like a 3-year-old girl named Maisie. That's mine. If you don't get what James is saying at the end of chapter 4, you will be so mad at James at the start of chapter 5. Because if my marriage is not mine, but it's my responsibility. If my kids are not mine, it's my responsibility to steward. If my life isn't even my own, but it's my responsibility, James starts right there and says, now let's talk about money. Because that's not yours either. Uh-oh. It got quiet in this Methodist church. Taylor, get up here and lead worship. They love that. Come on, my soul. Oh, don't you? But in James chapter 5, he says, if you missed that part right there, now listen, you who say. You're going to be real mad when he says, now listen, you rich people. You ready for it? Come on, it's not mine, it's my. Let's go to James 5, 1 through 6. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You've hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You've lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter and condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. Now, James is sharp, y'all. I mean, James is coming straight for the jugular. Right after it, okay? I'm not going to be so mean. I'm just reading the book of James in front of a group of people this morning, okay? Alan didn't say it. James said it. But what he was after is he was after this idea that these guys were hoarding their wealth. It was corroding like pirates' treasure on a buried box in an island. They were then using and abusing and taking advantage of workers and not paying them at all and trying to live in luxury and make more than anybody and then call it rich and then live in self-indulgence. He said they were hoarding it, and it was corroding in their soul. And so what James is wanting to get across is, in chapter 3, he talks about the ways of wisdom. In chapter 4, he talks about the ways of the world. And in chapter 5, he talks about the ways of wealth. And he tees up the concept by talking about, you are not your own. And so he's calling the church back to center, and he's going, for God in his generosity gave everything through his son. And he said, you sound like people who have now followed Jesus, and you've lost sight of the real purpose, and you're hoarding and hanging on to the money that you get, and you're saying, that's mine. That's mine. And James is calling them back to center. And he's doing it pretty intensely, I think you'd agree. And so using this, what I want to show you are the steps, because it's talking about financial freedom, and it's talking about how the ways of wealth can go according to God, and how we do what we do. And the whole Bible is replete about this stuff right here. Jesus talked about money more than he talked about heaven, hell, or prayer, and he called it mammon, which is a deistic term, because he knew it would have a godlike hold on people's lives. Timothy would call it the passion for paper. Like, it's just paper, y'all. You do understand. It's just paper at the end of the day. That's what he's trying to say. This is just paper. And so what I want to do is I want to walk you through a topical idea about varying mindsets as it concerns the money in your pocket. Now listen to me. God doesn't want the money in your pocket, but he does want the idol out of your heart. And it just so happens to be that usually the way you root greed, the idol of your heart, is by getting the money out of your pocket. You understand what I'm saying? And so the first stage on all of our journey with money and generosity is a question that we ask ourselves. And that question is this: what do I do with my stuff? Okay, what do I do with my stuff? Now listen, none of this is bad. It just might not be best. All of this is to help you lead across the continuum of God saying, let me see what I can do through you. Let me see what I can do through you. This is, what do I do with my stuff? Now, oftentimes we, at this point, have an emotional response to finances that is fearful or apathetic. And you know, the action step is to start to release that. That's what he's saying, that these guys were hoarding it and holding on to as much as they could with all that they had. And so this comes from 2 Corinthians 8, 7, 8, 9 says this, that your action step, he says, but since you excel in everything, this is Paul, you excel in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in complete earnestness, and in the love we've kindled in you, see that you also excel in this grace of giving. He says, I want you to release and start releasing with a mindset shift on what's yours and what's not. And so here's where it goes, that sometimes the actions in this are avoidance. We don't want to talk about it. Anger, like now we're talking about it. Even defensiveness or apologetic. Yeah, I don't give because blank, 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 blank. And the shift into the next level is simply, here's what I want you to do, is think, if you're in level 1, you go to this level, here's the question, what do I do with God's stuff? You see the difference? What do I do with my stuff? Well, you can do whatever you want if it's your stuff. You can do whatever you want with it. You can spend it here, you can spend it there. You might feel like you're living paycheck to paycheck, but you can do whatever you want. But when you make the shift and you say, okay, I now understand that if I'm God's special possession and I belong to him, that everything in my life is not mine, it's my responsibility to what? To steward. Just like the opportunities I have in life, I'm supposed to steward them. Then this is not mine. So now I want to think, what do I do with God's stuff? Okay, this comes from 2 Corinthians 9, 6 through 8. It says, remember this, whoever sows sparingly will reap sparingly. Whoever sows generously will also reap generously. And what happens is this, each of you should give what you've decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver, and God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. So at this level, some of us are here and it's more impulsive. It's, okay, every now and again I'll give. You know, I'm working on tithing right now. I'm working on it, but I'm not quite there yet. I'm not tithing, but I'm tipping. Is God okay with that? Well, hey, let me tell you, as your pastor, God's okay with it because we shifted you from what do I do with my stuff to at least what do I do with God's stuff. That's progress, and we celebrate progress at this church. Because now you've moved on the continuum, like, okay, I see that. Like, I used to not anything at all, but now I'm starting to say, okay, I'm not hoarding so it can corrode and nothing's going to happen to it. I'm now investing, and I'm seeing that God wants me to invest my life because it's here 1 minute and gone the next, and he also cares about what I do with what he's given me. It's his possession. Okay, I got it. And so now I'm giving, but it might be spontaneous. It might be under compulsion. And this verse would say, how do I move in my mindset under the idea of not compulsive, but what does God say? Okay, what do I do with God's stuff? Well, here's what you do. You ask a different question. Hey, Taylor, if you want to come up here, he will help me out. Here's the third question. What does God want me to do with God's stuff? Okay, so the second one was, what do I do with God's stuff? Am I making sense so far? Okay. Well, now I realize Taylor's, look at that. Hey. Taylor is God, so that would have worked in that scenario, you know. It's like, it is my stuff, Jack. I see you. Well, now I'm starting to understand that I started with nothing to begin with. That God gave me life. That I won the original race to even exist. And there's God's sovereign plan on that. I started with nothing. I'm not going to take anything with me. Okay, so what does God want me to do with God's stuff? Where are we coming up with this? Well, Psalm 24:1 says this, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and they that dwell therein. So you see how James 4 and James 5 just came together in Psalm 24:1. He said, you aren't your own either. God's been saying that since the beginning. But hello, it's made of something that comes from the earth. And God's like, when you say, what do I do with my stuff? He goes, well, you're asking the wrong question. And you go, why, God? And he goes, because you don't have anything. I own it all. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness therein. Making sense? Okay, so then you start saying, okay, well then, what does God want me to do with God's stuff? Now this starts to look a little different. It's not impulsive, it's not inconsistent. Now you start being thankful and grateful. There's a new attitude in your heart. You're like, wow. You start to see the emotion of people being blessed. Because they start to recognize, I really am only a steward. That's all I am. And so, what happens in this action step of giving is it's consistent. It's budgeted. It's a specific amount of going, I'm going to turn this over to the Lord because I understand that it's God's stuff. There's a lady in our church that I was talking to just a few weeks back, and she said, I started to trust the Lord with my giving. And I understood that it was God's stuff. And she said, I had trips I was going on, things that I had planned, but I just felt in my heart that God wanted me to trust him with the finances that I had. And so I did. And she said, my schedule got so full as a barber. My schedule got so full that I made all of that back that I gave and more, and made more in 1 week than I have ever made as a barber in my entire life. You can clap for that. Well, God says, okay, it's all mine. Now I'm concerned about how you're stewarding my stuff. And so you start stepping up and going, okay, God, how do I get consistent And how do I not hoard this? That you have something to say about the ways of wealth. If I'm really just a steward, I want to get this right. So some of you who might be just giving impulsively here or there, now you start going, let me give consistently to God through the local church, and let me see what God does then. Now, if you're at this place, the next step in giving is this question. What does God want me to give from what God has provided? Okay, it's a shift now, where now we understand that as we work and as we live, we move and have our being, that God provides. Will you provide? God provides, and He's the one who gave me the opportunity. He's the one who brought it in, and so now I'm going, okay, now God, you're providing. What does God want me to do based on what God has provided for me in my life? And so He provides, and He provides, and He keeps providing. Instead of me seeing it, well, this is mine. No, we've already covered this. That's not mine. It is my responsibility to steward it well. Okay, now this is where we get the idea of tithing from. Okay? In the book of Malachi, it talks about tithing, and it talks about the first fruits. Okay, the first fruits. So what that means is as God provides for us in our life, this is $10, $20 bills right here. We don't go, I'm gonna pay this first and that second and this, and God, I'm gonna just wait, and I'll give you the last fruits, because that's what the text says. No, now we start to realize, whoa, I'm a steward, I'm not an owner. It's not mine, it's my responsibility. What does God want me to give based on what God has provided for me in my life? God, you've been so good to me. My life's not my own. My story could have been a whole lot different. Okay, you saved me, you blessed me and all this. I'm going to trust you at your word. I started tipping a little bit and you started blessing. Okay, God, I'm going to trust you with the tithe. And before I do a thing, first fruits, that one is a reverence offering back to God. And God says, now you're starting to understand stewardship. 1 Timothy talks about this. He's getting towards the passion of paper, but in 1 Timothy 6 through 9, it says this. But godliness with contentment is great gain. I've said it, but I'll say it again because Timothy said it. Paul said it this way to Timothy. For we brought nothing into the world, and we could take nothing out of it. So let me pause right here and tie it all together. He's saying your life is short, y'all. It's a vapor, a mist, a handbreadth. How you steward your days is very important. How you invest your time and your talents here on earth is huge. Why? Because you don't have much time. There's an urgency to the gospel that we got to get this message out there. We got to go. We got to get people on mission. We got to live in the will of God. And then it's not just our time and our talent, but he says, but it's our treasure. Now we brought nothing in, so let's invest that in God's ways. If we adopt God's wisdom, if we adopt God's ways on the world, we ought to adopt God's ways on wealth. And he says, so you brought nothing in, you take nothing out. But if we have food and clothing, we'll be content with that. Those who want to get rich, that's their aim and their ambition, they fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. And this is verse 10. A lot of us have heard of this. We've misquoted it a bit. But here's what verse 10 says. For the love of money is a root, not the root. That's where it gets twisted. It is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, they get all they can all they get, and they sit on the can. You hear what I'm saying? Eager for money. Lighten the mood a little bit. Have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs in an attempt to get everything that they can. And God is saying, he's saying, but if you got food and you got clothing, you'll be content. Do you want your wealth to be corroded, or do you want your heart to be content? But godliness with contentment, God, it's not about how much I make. It's about honoring the Lord my God with everything he blessed me with. So what does God want me to give based on what God has provided for me in my life? And maybe this is your shot to say, okay, I'm going to trust the Lord with my giving. And I'm going to move up and say, okay, God, I'm going to give you the first fruits. Because I trust you. I've seen how you blessed me. This is where you get confident. The emotion attached to this is a full-blown confidence in what the Lord can do because you don't have worry anymore. You're like, God's blessed me, and now I understand, and I prioritize the things of the kingdom first before myself, that God supplied all my needs. And now it starts to be theologically correct. But it doesn't stop there. That's 4. What does God want me to give based on what God has provided for me in my life? Okay? The 5th one is this. What does God want me to keep from what God has provided? See, grace extends in our minds to every area of our life. God's got grace for sin. God's got grace for marriage. God's got grace for us in opportunities that in God's grace. And we live under the spirit of the law, but sometimes out of kind of a religious, dutiful practice, we go full letter of the law on tithing and say, I give the first fruits and that's all I do. I stop right there. Now listen, that is a massive step and some of us need to take that step. But what I'm telling you is that the 5th level is this idea of like, this might even look irrational sometimes. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't know why, but I feel compelled by God that I want to keep all this, but God wants me to keep just that and give this. Does that make sense? What is this? This is 1 Timothy 6, 17 through 19. It says this, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds. Sounds just like what James was just saying. And to be generous and willing to share. This is what we call a surrendered giver. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. That means that giving is living. That's what it means. And there are things that sometimes look irrational. You can give Taylor a round of applause as he's seated. Sometimes that things look irrational. This is where the extravagance of like, wow, I just want to be on mission, and God sometimes tells me to keep less than I thought he would, but I'm just so surrendered to it. I became an initial giver and then a consistent giver and then, a spiritual giver. Now I'm at this surrendered stage of like, oh, wow. God, whatever you want, it's all yours. It's not mine, it's my responsibility. I'm going to tell you the story of a person you'll probably never meet. 21 days of prayer and fasting in January 2021. I got a phone call from a guy who lived in California, and he said, hey, I've been, tracking with what's been going on in your church, and I just sold my business, and I want to do something pretty irrational, but God told me to. And I said, what's that? And he said, well, when are you gonna come here soon? And I'd had some trips to San Diego all the way up the coast, and so I said, I'll be there next month. He said, why don't you swing by? I said, yeah, I'm coming for a wedding, and so I'll be there next month. I didn't think anything of it, and so I just kept preaching all this. We have Vision Sunday. And on Vision Sunday in January of 21, our vision was one more. And so some of y'all remember that. We had t-shirts that said one more on them. And I opened the service that morning, and I read a story from a pastor named Rick Warren. And the story goes like this. His dad was dying in the hospital bed, and his dad would wake up, and he would say, gotta save one more for Jesus. Gotta save one more for Jesus. And then he would conk back out, and he was slipping in and out of consciousness on his deathbed, about to pass away. And Pastor Rick Warren, sitting there, was like, man, my dad just wants to win one more for Jesus. His dad wakes up near the time he was about to die and looks at Rick, and he changes it from gotta win one more for Jesus. And he looks at Rick and he says, son, win one more for Jesus. Win one more for Jesus. And he passes away, and he said it was like this mantle being passed over to me. One more for Jesus. One more for Jesus. So I preached that message, and Amanda and I, we fly out to California several weeks later, and we go and we visit with this individual. And we have a time at their house, and it's great. And he said, oh, just a minute. I want to give you something. Remember, I called you in January, 21 days of prayer and fasting. I said, yeah, you did. And so he said, hang on, just a minute. Let me go back to the back bedroom. And he did. He went back to the back bedroom. And he comes back out with this check. And he hands me the check. And the check is for $70,000. Written to Vivid Church. And I looked down at the for line. And what it was for, it says one more for Jesus. I look up at him. Tears running down his eyes. He says, I watch every week. And I can't be there. But I can do something irrational. Because we're going to win one more for Jesus in that church. We're going to win one more for Jesus. We're going to keep on going. That's the gospel. He said, God has blessed me, and I started a giving journey a long time ago, and God told me to do something wild. And I said, that's crazy, because we were just in 21 days of prayer and fasting, and since then, we've seen over 150 people come to Jesus. That was one more for Jesus. We've seen over 60 baptisms, and this individual's like, that's why I give. Because I understand it's just paper. But we're creating an environment where people are able to come to know him, where we get on mission and we start releasing it from our hands, because we're not hoarding wealth up that can corrode. We're laying treasure up in heaven so we'll be content now. And listen to me, it's not about the numbers. It's about looking at what you have right now and saying, God, I want to trust you. And sometimes that looks like backpacks for students that may not be able to afford them. And sometimes it looks like businesses when they get sold. From backpacks to businesses, I'm calling you to go all in with your faith and say, God, I understand that there's a better title for this message. It's not mine. Like Maisie said, it's hers. God, it's all yours. All that I have. And when you ask me, I'll say yes. That's the gospel. Thanks for watching. Head over to vividchurch.com so that you can stay updated with all things Vivid Church. Join us in person or online for one of the services so that you can be a part of our Vivid Church family. But don't stop there. Please share this video so that we can help other people live the vivid story that God has for them. Thank you.